The materials submitted today argues that the multi-entity financial consolidation problem is fundamentally an architectural failure requiring a unified ledger solution, rather than just better spreadsheet processes.
Right, in reading this piece, honestly, it felt like intercepting the secret, stress-induced diary of a corporate controller.
Yeah, it really did.
I mean, framing the standard group P&L not as a true, infallible financial statement, but rather as a controlled estimate is just a remarkably strong piece of rhetoric. It immediately validates the chronic anxiety finance teams feel every single month-end close.
Exactly. But diving right into our first piece of feedback,
Yeah.
overlooking the practical friction of redesigning a data landscape leaves the proposed unified ledger architecture feeling, well, slightly utopian.
Mm-hmm.
The material confidently asserts that this unified architecture is, available now and well understood. It acts like it's a definitive mathematical cure for the data heterogeneity problem.
Right.
But as I read through it, I noticed a significant gap. It completely ignores the massive organizational, financial, and frankly, change management hurdles involved in moving away from entrenched legacy ERP systems.
Oh, completely.
By waving away the harsh realities of implementation, the argument loses some of its pragmatic credibility.
Yeah, because the author spends a vast amount of time meticulously detailing the structural failures of the current state. We read about the multi-GAAP adjustments, the currency mismatches.
The agonizing intercompany eliminations.
Yes, exactly. They build this highly technical, really compelling case for why the current patchwork system is fundamentally broken. But then when they present the solution, it's positioned almost as a magic wand.
Yeah, it is.
There's an implicit assumption here that once the logical architectural case for a unified ledger is made, the organization they'll just seamlessly adopt it.
Right.
Is the connection between recognizing the architectural flaw and actually executing a multi-year system overhaul fully established in the material, or is that an area to potentially bolster?
I can see what you're going for here. Let's see how we can strengthen this, because I want to push back on the author's underlying premise that pure logic wins the day in corporate finance.
Oh, it definitely doesn't.
Right? I mean, isn't it true that in enterprise finance, the biggest enemy of a new system is the comfort of the old, broken system?
Mm-hmm.
Even a manual, error-prone spreadsheet is a devil the finance team already knows. You can see the cells. You can trace your own VLOOKUPs.
Yep.
A brand new overarching architectural platform feels like a black box until you actually trust it.
You are hitting on the exact psychological barrier that derails these projects in the real world. The weakness here is that the author treats the transition to a unified ledger as a purely technical exercise.
Yeah, they really do.
They are totally ignoring the political and psychological friction of abandoning legacy systems. In reality, ripping out or layering over legacy financial systems is, well, it's one of the most terrifying prospects for a corporate board.
Oh, absolutely.
Because historically, ERP transitions go vastly over budget, and they just routinely paralyze daily operations.
So what's the suggestion here?
The suggestion is to acknowledge these implementation hurdles directly and provide a framework for navigating them. Ground the theoretical solution in operational reality. Don't just tell the reader that the architecture exists.
Tell them how to survive adopting it.
Exactly.
I wonder, though, if the author omitted that because they feared turning a sleek architectural argument into, like, a dry project management manual.
That's a fair point.
I bet they thought, if I start talking about implementation timelines, I'll lose the visionary tone.
Right.
But there has to be a middle ground. How do we outline the survival of this journey without losing the narrative momentum?
Well, we can look at a few concrete examples of how to weave this operational reality directly into the narrative. First, the author could include a brief, sharply focused section discussing a phased rollout versus a rip-and-replace strategy.
Okay, yeah.
When a multinational corporation is integrating multiple legacy ERPs, say a massive SAP instance in Germany, an old Oracle database in the US, and, some mid-market platform from a recent acquisition in Brazil.
You don't switch them all over at midnight on a Sunday.
Definitely not. So the text should explicitly address how a unified ledger architecture allows you to layer the solution over the single most problematic entity first.
Oh, I see.
By demonstrating how the architecture pulls data from that specific chaotic subsidiary without disrupting the broader corporate machinery, you create an early win.
Right.
And that early win builds the organizational trust necessary to expand the footprint.
Taking that a step further, I'd argue the friction isn't just psychological, it's highly political.
Oh, completely.
If you were introducing a massive new data architecture to solve consolidation problems, the IT department is going to immediately lay claim to the project.
Yeah, they'll view it as a data pipeline initiative.
Exactly. But finance wants to own it because they're the ones ultimately signing their names to the compliance and accuracy of the output.
And that classic power struggle between the CFO and the IT department is completely absent from the text.
It really is.
Yet it dictates the fate of almost every major financial transformation. The author could offer a specific strategy for the finance team to win that internal battle. They need to arm the CFO with the argument that a unified ledger is primarily a financial governance tool, not just an IT data repository.
Right. Because the IT department shouldn't own the architecture, since the SEC doesn't knock on the CIO's door when the earnings per share calculation is wrong.
Exactly. And by making it clear that these are just a few ways to bridge the gap between theory and execution, the author shows the reader they understand the trenches of enterprise finance, not just the architectural summit.
So, a key theme running through this material seems to be the tension between different factions in a business.
Yeah.
You know, finance versus IT, logic versus human comfort. And smoothly navigating those internal battles naturally brings up the question of exactly who inside the organization this material is actually trying to persuade.
Which leads right into our second critique.
Right, the dramatic shift from deep operational minutia to high-level board governance creates a disjointed experience for the reader.
It really does.
The weakness here is that the text spends a significant amount of time deep in the operational weeds. It discusses specific GAAP adjustment templates, the mechanics of closing intercompany mismatches, where entity A records a sale but entity B hasn't recorded the receipt.
And the agonizing pain of tracking down historical exchange rates?
Yes, but then it abruptly pivots in the conclusion to a list of strategic governance questions the board of directors should be asking.
Right.
This creates a split personality in the text, making it unclear whether the intended audience is a stressed financial controller trying to close the books or a corporate director trying to manage shareholder risk.
The author actually does a brilliant job diagnosing the pain of the controller. I mean, the section on how intercompany eliminations never quite clear due to currency fluctuations between Tuesday and Thursday.
Yeah.
Forcing controllers to just plug dummy numbers to make the balance sheet balance, that is authentic, boots on the ground reality. But then we suddenly jump to the boardroom, and the language completely changes. The weakness is that these two worlds, the operational and the strategic, they're treated sequentially rather than symbiotically.
Yeah, they are.
The author isolates the operational pain in the first half and the strategic governance in the second half.
It feels like we're taking the reader on an intense tour of the engine room, pointing out every loose gasket, every faulty pressure valve, and detailing the exact temperature of the leaking steam, and then suddenly asking them to steer the ship from the captain's chair.
That is a perfect analogy.
You can't just teleport the reader from the boiler to the bridge and expect them to immediately grasp how that specific faulty valve affects the steering trajectory of the entire vessel.
No, you really can't.
I assume the author wrote it this way because that's how the month-end close chronologically feels. You spend 3 weeks buried in the weeds, and then you have 1 hour to present a polished summary to the board.
That is a very plausible theory for how the draft took this shape. And that engine room analogy perfectly captures the structural problem. But, could the evidence also support a different conclusion? Perhaps the author assumes the reader will naturally make the mental leap between the operational failure and the strategic risk.
Maybe.
The suggestion here is to remove that assumption entirely. The author needs to create a structural bridge that explicitly translates the operational pain points into strategic board-level risks much earlier in the narrative, rather than isolating them at the very end.
Show how the loose gasket threatens the ship's course the exact moment the gasket is introduced.
Exactly.
If I'm the author, though, I might worry that trying to appeal to both the controller and the board simultaneously will just water down the message for both. How do they rebuild that structure without losing the specialized appeal to each group?
Well, let's look at the 4 reasons the author lists for why consolidated numbers cannot be trusted. Instead of waiting until the conclusion to address the board's perspective, they should map each of these operational reasons directly to board-level impacts as they are introduced.
Okay, give me an example.
For instance, the author deeply discusses the operational headache of currency translation differences. Right now, it's framed purely as an annoyance for the finance team trying to balance the books. The author should explicitly link that to, say, unexplained earnings per share volatility that the board must defend to shareholders.
Oh, wow, that instantly changes the dynamic. Because a 2-cent miss on earnings per share isn't just a rounding error to a board director.
Not at all.
Algorithmic trading models punish stock prices mercilessly for unexplained EPS volatility.
Exactly the point. When a board has to explain to Wall Street why earnings missed expectations due to a Brazilian GAAP translation error buried in a spreadsheet,
Yeah.
it ceases to be an accounting problem. It becomes a severe valuation problem.
Right.
Building on that point, what if we looked at it from the perspective of the multi-GAAP inconsistencies mentioned in the text? Currently, this is described as an audit annoyance, relying on last year's fragile spreadsheet templates. The author should frame this not just as an inefficient operational process, but as a severe compliance liability for external SEC reporting.
Right, because if a board director reads that multi-GAAP adjustments are being done ad hoc, with manual overrides under severe time pressure at midnight,
Yeah.
they shouldn't just think, oh, we need to buy the controller better software. They should immediately think, we are highly exposed to a material weakness finding by our auditors.
Absolutely.
And a material weakness finding spikes the company's cost of capital. By adjusting the framing of these examples, the author unifies the operational and strategic themes.
Exactly.
It teaches the controller exactly how to pitch the solution to the board using the language of risk, and it makes it painstakingly clear to the board why they must fund the controller's architectural request.
Making the material resonate with both the controller and the board isn't just about structural alignment, though. It's deeply dependent on refining the specific language used to describe the technical solution itself.
Right.
The words chosen dictate the emotional resonance of the entire argument.
Which leads us to our final critique. Relying heavily on abstract systems terminology dilutes the strong emotional hook established in the opening paradox.
It really does.
I mean, the introduction of this material is genuinely excellent. It creates a vivid, almost suspenseful picture of a CFO's anxiety when asked, "Are we confident in this?" right before a final board pack is distributed.
It's a great opening.
It establishes a very human protagonist facing a daunting, systemic antagonist. However, when the text transitions to explaining the actual unified ledger architecture, it becomes bogged down in dense, passive phrases like source agnosticism, semantic foundation, and maintained data assets.
Yeah.
This sudden influx of dry, conceptual jargon entirely distances the reader from the human stakes of the problem.
The author hooks us with raw emotion, the terrifying fear of standing behind a consolidated financial number you secretly know is built on a fragile house of cards. But as soon as we enter the solution phase of the document, our protagonist completely disappears. We stop talking about the CFO's anxiety and start reading what feels like a software vendor's sterile technical white paper.
Yeah, exactly.
The weakness is that the text abandons its most compelling asset, the human experience of financial consolidation, in favor of rigid architectural definitions. This drains the narrative momentum entirely.
Let's look closely at the section discussing the architecture. The material makes a strong case for the unified ledger by highlighting the technical specs. But as I read about maintained data assets, I lost the human thread.
Right.
I almost felt like the author fell so deeply in love with the elegance of their technological solution that they forgot who they were writing for. I forgot all about that CFO sweating in the boardroom.
Yeah.
I bet the author believes that if they don't use this heavy academic jargon, the technical buyers or the IT department just won't take their architecture seriously.
That is an incredibly common trap when writing from a place of deep technical expertise. You want to prove the undeniable robustness of the system, so you lean heavily on the terminology.
But is there a risk that focusing solely on the technical architecture might overlook the fundamental truth that technology is only valuable because of what it allows humans to do?
Absolutely. The suggestion here is to anchor the technical architectural pillars with concrete, high-stakes human scenarios that maintain the narrative's emotional momentum.
Okay.
We don't need to delete the terms like source agnosticism, but we desperately need to re-inject the protagonist back into the technical solution
to show the CFO actually wielding this new architecture to conquer the anxieties established in the introduction.
I love the idea of showing the technology as a tangible tool in the protagonist's hand, rather than just a floating concept in a cloud diagram. Let's explore how we actually execute that. How do we make a term like full drill-through visibility feel dramatically real?
Well, the text currently has a section titled Full Drill-Through Visibility, which neutrally describes it as an analytical capability allowing navigation from consolidated top-line figures down to source transactions.
Right.
Instead of simply defining the capability, the author should illustrate it with a high-stakes scene.
Oh, okay.
Imagine a scenario where our protagonist, CFO, stands before an aggressive, skeptical audit committee. A director aggressively challenges a consolidated revenue figure, suspecting an anomaly.
Mm-hmm.
In the current spreadsheet-driven reality, the CFO would have to say, "I'll have my team look into the localized data and get back to you next week."
Right, which is painful.
But in this scenario, the CFO instantly double-clicks that contested figure on a screen in front of the committee. They drill down continuously through the multi-GAAP adjustments, bypass the intercompany eliminations, and pull up the exact specific local transaction in a Brazilian subsidiary that generated the variance, ending the argument on the spot.
Wow, that paints an incredibly vivid picture. It immediately shows the CFO transitioning from a state of defensive vulnerability to a state of absolute undeniable command.
Exactly.
The technology is the vehicle for that transformation. What about some of the more tedious operational features mentioned, like the automated currency translation? How do we make something that dry feel emotionally resonant?
Instead of neutrally describing automated currency translation as a back-end system process that calculates differences in equity components based on fluctuating exchange rates,
Yeah, which is a mouthful.
the author should describe the visceral human relief it brings. They could paint a picture of a group finance team staring down a Friday evening deadline. Normally, this team would have to spend their entire weekend manually extracting data, hunting down historical central bank reference rates, and risking a catastrophic copy-paste error just to perform a Brazilian GAAP to IFRS conversion in a massive, fragile Excel workbook.
Oh, the stress.
Right? Show the reader the Friday evening where the team actually gets to log off at 5 p.m. because the system maintained the auditable exchange rates and performed the translation automatically.
It transforms a dry technical manual into a story of professional redemption.
It really does.
By injecting the protagonist into these operational details, the author proves that a concept like source agnosticism isn't just a lifeless technical specification. It's the literal mechanism that buys back the finance team's sanity and protects the company's valuation.
And it reminds the reader at every single turn why they should care about the underlying architecture in the first place. You can keep the technical rigor, but you must constantly tie it back to the human beings who have to live with the consequences of the system.
Well, to recap the main points of our critique today, we identified that overlooking the practical friction of legacy implementation leaves the architecture feeling utopian and disconnected from reality.
Right.
We discussed how the dramatic, unbridled shift from operational spreadsheet details to high-level board governance creates a disjointed experience for the reader.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, we explored how relying on abstract systems terminology dilutes the emotional hook of the opening paradox.
And to summarize the actionable takeaways for the author first, add a phased implementation roadmap and explicitly address internal political battles to ground the solution in operational reality.
Right.
Second, structurally tie the 4 reasons for consolidation failure directly to strategic board-level risks the moment they are introduced, rather than isolating them at the end.
Exactly.
And finally, use scenario-based, human-centric examples to explain the technical concepts, ensuring the CFO protagonist remains present and active throughout the entire narrative.
We warmly invite the listener to implement these suggestions and submit the revised work back in for another round of feedback in a future critique. The author has built an incredibly powerful engine here. Now, they just need to make sure the reader never loses sight of how all those gears and valves connect to the captain's wheel.